Hello. How's it going? Good. All right, cool. I like an interactive audience. So I'm going to talk really briefly about kind of the growth of immersive in themed experiences and like things that we're thinking about that are kind of in this themed experience space as well, right? So initially I was like, well, normally I like to kind of give you the history, some definitions, then do some analysis and talk about what's next, like how do we overcome these challenges. We don't have time for that, so that's not what we're going to do. So we're just going to look at some of the definitions in history so that we're working from kind of the same framework as we go into this discussion. So, and then we'll chat with Carly and take your questions. So definitions. What is immersive? Anyone have ideas? What's immersive? Audience participation. Shout it out. What's immersive? Yeah. Would you say environment? Yeah, an environment that engrosses you. That's great. Other elements of immersive? Yes. 360 kind of like immersion? Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, sensory experience. It sounds like everyone is familiar with kinds of like the physical aspects of an immersive experience. So here's my definition. I think that immersive entertainment is really characterized by the intersection of these different three elements. One, these things that we're talking about, this physical environment, right? An immersive set and setting. Two, the participant's agency. This is the action and impacts that the audience is able to have on an experience. And then three, there's this kind of element of gamification. And I know that gamification within game circles is sort of a dirty word. So what I'm really talking about here is tasks, activities, puzzles, mechanics, ways that we can interact with our environment that help to provide that agency that we're looking for. So these things work together and they create the experience of embodied play. So here's a visualization of this concept, right? Looking at these kind of three axes intersecting, and you can see that there are a number of different art forms that kind of fit within these categories in like different spaces, right? So in the lower agency forms, you see things like traditional theater, we've got immersive art exhibits, things where you don't necessarily have a lot of agency over what's going on. And then in the very high agency forms, you have things like escape rooms, interactive theater, LARP. So there's a spectrum on which a lot of these different things exist. And they all sort of fit in this category of immersive. And colloquially, people have started to use this term to talk about anything that is within these spaces, whether or not it has a lot of agency, whether or not it has a lot of gamification, whether or not it has a lot of very engrossing physical set and setting. So where did this come from? Like, where have we been and where is this, what got us here? So in theme park world, we kind of start with streetmosphere. So is anyone familiar with streetmosphere and what that term means? So streetmosphere was improvised performances that started to take place in the 80s. They started working with a lot of directors who had previously worked in Ren fairs and things like that, and they started bringing in players who were, and by players I mean like troupe actors like that, were engaging with the audience, trying to get people to provide some words and some participation. Sometimes they put a little funny hat on them, things like that. Then in the 90s, they started experimenting with this format even more. There was this great thing called the Adventurers Club. This was a show that had a lot of audience engagement and like a very deep level of immersion where the characters kind of had storylines that the audience could help to solve. Then you see kind of technology start to integrate itself into the theme park world, especially in 2010 when Diagon Alley hit the scene. Everybody got very excited about that because it had all these interactive elements. Your wand, if you spun your wand in the right direction, and then things would react to that. So this integration of technology started to help people become even more immersed in these lands. And you'll see that theme parks nowadays, almost nothing that's being developed for theme parks is not that immersive type of setting. Then in 2021, Disney came out with Star Wars Galactic Starcruiser, was this project that I worked on. And this was the most kind of exciting, like new, it was the integration of technology, it was the live action show, it had all of these persistent characters, people stayed overnight, they never left the Star Wars universe. So it was a very big undertaking. So some examples of kind of what this has looked like in theme park world. These are those streetmosphere interactors, World Showcase players, kind of a medieval acting troupe. The Citizens of Hollywood, this was a kind of 50s themed people who lived on Main Street and would interact with you. The Adventurers Club, which I talked about a little bit already. Citizens of Main Street, this was a little bit more Victorian themed, like they took that same idea of like people who live in the theme park and then they expanded that. For a little while there were Jawa traders at the Disney Hollywood Studios at the launch bay. This was cool because the Jawa traders had a bunch of stuff, and like if you traded them stuff, they would give you things in return, so that was very cool. If you gave them trash, they would just throw it away and yell at you, but like, if you gave them stuff, they would interact. Then they did this really cool experiment, Legends of Frontierland, and this was in Disneyland in 2014. And this was the kind of first experiment that Disney was doing with a live-action role-playing game type of thing. Of course, the Wizarding World of Diagon Alley and all the expansions that Universal has done with that, obviously that's had a huge impact on the way that a lot of people, the expectations of what people have from a theme park and the immersive quality of what they're expecting. And when they opened Black Spire Outpost in Disney, initially they had a number of players who were kind of like the citizens of Batu. This was the Black Spire Outpost welcoming committee, and they had tasks and puzzles and different things for you to do and figure out with them. And then, of course, there was Star Wars Galactic Starcruiser, which lasted about a year and a half before it closed. Super Nintendo World is starting to really integrate a lot of like elements of gameplay as well as immersion into their things. There are these unlockable quests that you can only get once you've like leveled up and then unlocked a bunch of other things. It's very cool. In London, Phantom Peak is this new kind of theme park in which you have storylines and quests that you are going to pursue throughout your journey there over the course of the day, and they change up the content of that every 3 months. There are new storylines, new quests, new interactions with characters. So they're keeping this kind of schedule of evergreen content. Very, very cool, very impressive stuff. Meanwhile, in the theater world, we have a similar sort of like trajectory towards this movement towards agency. So in 1989, there's Tony and Tina's Wedding. This was a New York City off-Broadway show, kind of like one of the first hallmarks of this interacting with the audience and the audience being a part of the show in a diegetic way. Joe's New York City Bar, this was originally developed in Orlando, Florida, but it started traveling all over with Fringe. Sleep No More, this was a watershed moment for a lot of immersive experiences. So many people had never been experienced any kind of thing like this art form. And then when Sleep No More really premiered in New York City in 2011, this became inspiring for a whole generation of immersive creators. And then in the 2020s is what I like to call the great immersioning, where everyone is just using immersive as a buzzword term to try to sell tickets. So if an actor walks through the aisle in a Broadway show, they're like, it's immersive. No, it's not. Meanwhile, in the world of LARP, live action role-playing, has anyone heard of live action role-playing before? Yeah, all right, awesome, great. So in the 70s and 90s, we kind of have the start of what we think of as modern LARPing. You can say that LARPing has started as far back as like Commedia dell'arte, really, but like in 70s and 90s is what we start to see as our modern incarnation. So this was kind of born out of the Dungeons and Dragons role-playing game. A lot of fantasy games started to come into existence. There's a type of fighting in this style of LARP that is very common called boffer fighting. It's where you have like foam-covered weapons and you smack each other with them. It's great. Then in the 90s and 2000s, like LARP starts to expand and have more categories, more genres. There's Vampire the Masquerade. There's Nero, which starts to have franchises and like different operations. Then in the 2010s is when the sort of Nordic style game and blockbuster style games start to hit the scene. These are much more high quality, high production value sorts of things. These start to gain momentum in the United States. Finally, in 2022, the festival style game starts to make its way into the US. So the first festival style game in the US is Drachenfest US, which is based off of its German counterpart, which has been operating for 15 plus years. Now Drachenfest US is in its third year, so this is an even larger scale game. So we're talking thousands of people coexist in a medieval town that they build over the course of 3 days and then do that for a week. It's very cool. Escape games. So in 95 is kind of in Sweden is maybe like the first idea of this questing rooms and questing games. That's Bodeborg. In the 2000s, we see the first escape game, and that comes out of Japan. In the 2010s, the US market starts to explode with popularity for the escape games. And then we start to see the evolution of the escape game in 2017 through 2020, and like now, where now there are even more options for participants, like the environments that they're working with are really high fidelity, really high quality, all kinds of cool stuff happening in the escape game world. Meanwhile, immersive art world, right? We've got the light and space movement of the 70s. These things start to take on like bigger meaning and have more audience. 2003 is the Weather Project, which was a huge watershed moment in kind of the light and space movement. In 2008, Meow Wolf Collective started out of Santa Fe. Meow Wolf now has 4 locations, and they have announced that they're going to be doing a bunch more. And then, again, the great immersioning, right? So now, like, there are immersive art exhibits everywhere. And if somebody's projecting some art onto a wall, they're like, it's immersive. And there's tons of things that I didn't cover, but I'm just going to give you an idea here. So there's also alternate reality games. There are marketing activations. There's tons of extended reality and things that exist within this space as well. So what are all these things pointing at, right? All these things are coming together. There's this convergence of storytelling, theater, art, game, movement, role play, technology, environment, and these things are all converging, and I think that that's really interesting, and I think it speaks to a need that we have as human beings and as a society right now, and I think that what we really want is meaningful agency. We want connection, and we want to feel as though our impact on the world has meaning. So, without further ado, let's talk.
Thank you so much for that. I want to start with the first question, which is about, you talked about the role-playing aspect, right? And something I noticed evolving with these is how much people are role-playing and how much control they have over that role-playing. Can you talk a little bit about how that worked in Starcruiser?
Yeah. So in Starcruiser, we very much encouraged and invited the audience to come with their own ideas and their own characters. And even people who didn't do that found that they were immediately treated as though they existed in the Star Wars universe. So even if they're using their real names and they're dressed in plain clothes, we would just meet them where they are, assume at face value that they are a part of the Star Wars universe, and ask them what is their home planet and things like that. So there are ways, I think, that I think sometimes people get very nervous about role-playing initially, but if everybody around you is role-playing, it's not weird anymore, and it becomes very natural. So that was something that we really wanted to do, is give people the thinnest possible alibi to be able to try out some new things, like make some different decisions than they normally would.
An interesting thing with that too, right? So you have kind of permission to act a certain way. Have you, you've worked on a bunch of different kinds of these projects. How do people respond to that permission? Like, do people know how to behave? Do you teach them how to behave? Like, what happens when you throw someone in an environment?
So there's this concept within LARP academic circles of herd competency. It's kind of debated whether or not this is something that is real or not. But in my observation, if you throw somebody into an environment of people who are all know how to behave within the situation, they behave accordingly. So the idea is that if people are already kind of role-playing and we're all buying into the reality, that it won't be hard for a new person to understand that. Another part of it is context and scaffolding, right? So if I tell you that you're going to Tony and Tina's wedding, you have an idea already of what a wedding looks like, how to behave at a wedding, how you should probably dress for a wedding. So with something like Starcruiser, for example, the idea is that you're going on vacation on a star line. So people have already a good understanding of kind of what that social context is, so that it's not hard to immerse themselves in it.
Something I hear a lot about people kind of like, often in a critical way, right, is like that people are doing various things that are immersion breaking, right? Like, what what does it mean to break immersion? And like, is that fair to throw at people that are just like random people that showed up for a theater play, for example? Or like, I've really been thinking about this of like, what does it mean? Like, what is the obligation of the audience? And who's in charge of conveying that obligation?
I don't know.
Right? It's like a weird problem.
It's a tough problem, because I think that for some people, having that space of total immersion is like, that's the thing that they're there for. They really want that. They really value that. And for other people, they don't necessarily value that the same way, right? They want to kind of take breaks. Maybe role-playing is sort of difficult or exhausting for them. So having some moments of out-of-character levity can be really nice. So I don't know that there's a right answer to this. I think that part of it is just trying to meet people where they're at. And if you're not enjoying your interaction with someone, leg it.
Yeah. Like, maybe that's not the right game.
Right.
Sorry, I did make notes. Another thing I'm thinking about, and I think you were starting to kind of get at this, is there's a real tension between how individualized an experience is and how much it costs, right? Can you talk a little bit about, because I think doing, for example, even just a fully immersive theatrical experience, there's costs there you wouldn't have with conventional theater. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can talk a lot about that. Productions of the quality and value that you see in modern day cost a lot of money. If you are even being, even starting to be fair to your cast members and to like all of the artists that it takes to come together and put these things together, then the production cost is very high. Recently, I was throwing an event. The cost of the event, not excluding the venue, just the fixed costs that I had for cast, for paying for their travel, for costumes, for other things like that, was $10,000. So, and that's for an audience of up to like 150 people. But what that ends up working out to is a really high ticket price for people. So it is something that is just really challenging within the immersive landscape right now. We don't necessarily have the business models as figured out as I would like, nor do we have the funding to make it as accessible as I think it should be, because I do think that everybody deserves to feel welcome and be able to participate in these things, and it shouldn't be something that is just like class privilege.
Yeah, so with LARPs, a lot of times, and even Ren fairs, right? Not all of them, but especially historically Ren fairs, they're actually relying a lot on volunteer labor. But of course, if you're trying to actually treat the people doing this as professionals, like that's not an option. And even sometimes using volunteer labor, it's not just like, oh, good, check, we don't have to pay for that, right? Like,
right.
Yeah.
Well, and probably also illegal.
Right. I mean, South by Southwest seems to get away with it, but like,
yeah, there are federal regulations around fair labor and standards and practices, and if you're making money off of your event, you have an obligation to pay the people who are working on that event. So if you're not a nonprofit, if you're a nonprofit, then volunteer work, there's different things, but. But I think that the way that it's working right now is, like you said, it's a labor of love for many people, and whether or not they are doing it within the bounds of what is actually the law is totally not, it's not something anyone's really paying attention to right now, but I think it's something we should be paying attention to.
Yeah, there's also a lot of interesting things here about kind of the affordances, I think, from having immersive performances. So if you have a cast on a stage, like they're pretty insulated from the audience, or even us sitting up here, like we're pretty insulated from you, right? But if you're thinking about like conventional theater, right? Like if I go to something at Chicago Shakespeare or, you know, the Chicago Theater, any of these, like I'm not like next to the cast, even if I'm in the front row, but often with immersive performances, you are right next to the cast, which is a really different level of interaction. How do you, like as someone that's doing production or design in these areas, like how do you design for the safety of the cast?
That's a great question. I think that the safety is an issue that is constantly being talked about, especially within these spaces, because the idea of safety is a little bit of, it's a little bit of an illusion, right? What we're really trying to do is mitigate risk. No matter what activity you're doing, there are going to be risks involved. But when you take away the stage, have cast members interacting with people directly, and then feed them alcohol, the risks multiply, right? So these are things that there are a number of different like tools and systems that people have developed, including hand signals and gestures in order to kind of tell somebody like, I'm not comfortable with this, ways to disengage from people. On Starcruiser, there was always the option for cast members to walk off, right? They do not have to interact with anybody that they don't want to interact with. And there continue to be more and more like safety, like ideas around safety and risk mitigation that get implemented in these spaces. I think that part of it is just being human with other people is not a no-risk activity, right? There are going to be risks anytime that you're interacting with somebody that are as small as like my feelings were hurt to as large as this person did something that like really upset me and that is criminal, right? So it's just an ongoing conversation and one that I think that we should be paying a lot of attention to.
Yeah, and there's so much complexity too about like trying to kind of like let people feel like they have all that agency while also kind of constraining them.
Absolutely.
I actually had a really funny experience at Sleep No More, which is there's a bunch of paper that you can read in Sleep No More for anybody that hasn't been there, and I was like very invested in all these like fake medical records, so I'm just like reading all the records.
Yeah.
And I was in there long enough, they just turned the light off in the room on me.
Oh my
like
God.
apparently I was there too long, like they didn't want you to stay and read all the records. That was not like the thing to do, so they just took all the lights to like herd me onto the next space. And I'm always really intrigued by that, because that show also at the end, they like very deliberately herd everyone, but I had started seeing where they were doing it throughout in ways that were much more subtle, and it was like the sound would change, the light would change.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
Well, and Sleep No More has been criticized for some of initially when it started showing, there was a huge lack of safety standards. There was, performers would come up and like, and grab you and touch you, and that was something that some people did not know was going to happen and were not warned that was a possibility of happening and had no way to signal that they didn't want that to happen. So I think that they've changed a little bit of their onboarding to be a little more clear about that and say if you don't want to interact with a cast member, you know, if a cast member enters the room, stand somewhere else, you know, stand somewhere in the back so that they're less likely to interact with you. And ways to also keep cast members safe from the same thing, right? Like that. It's like this cosplay is not consent idea, right? That just because you are an interactive character doesn't mean that you are obligated to give anybody your time or attention or that they have any access, like rights to your physical body or anything like that.
Yeah, it's interesting thinking about, I mean, a place that you see a lot of this that is actually considered quite separate is in haunts, right? So haunted houses, haunted attractions of other kinds. And that's an interesting field because there's a real push to professionalize at the same time that a lot of this is run in really kind of like quasi, right? Like they're not professional casts, they're kind of like weird little pop-up things. And so there's a real tension in that industry.
Absolutely.
And that's also somewhere where it's like...
And scare actors get assaulted on the regular.
Oh yeah, I punched an actor once because I asked before I went in if anyone would touch me and they said no, and I'm like, okay, cool, and I paid and went in and someone touched me and I freaked out.
Yeah.
And I'm like, sorry, I was 11, I didn't have very good judgment, I probably still don't. I don't go in haunted houses anymore, this is how I've solved this problem. But like I had asked specifically because I knew. I was like, I can't handle this thing, therefore I will ask. And you know, someone grabbed my shoulder and I was like, oh.
Decked
yeah,
them.
with all my 11-year-old fury, right? But it is like this interesting things about all the affordances, and like I'm also interested in thinking about kind of like the history of the Ren Fair here and how critical that is. There's a great book called Well Met that's a history of the Ren Fair, and it actually looks at the political history of it because it comes out of kind of 60s counterculture, right, and into the 70s. And so I think you're often also kind of looking at almost a utopian thought here. And so a lot of times it's like, what does it mean to build a world, and what would it mean to build a world that's better, right? And can you talk about kind of like when you're designing your projects, like what's kind of the impulse or what's the thing you're trying to convey?
Oh, I think there's definitely a major element of that. I mean, for me, it highly depends on the project, right? There are different goals for different projects, but I do think that there's an idea of if we can imagine what better looks like and get to play in a world where we feel what better feels like, we then, dissolve some of our ideas about what is holding us back. And new ideas, we start to water the seeds of what is possible. And I think that that's an important space for us to live in as we think about our future.
What do immersive experiences give people that they can't get somewhere else, whether that's daily life or from other art or media forms?
Oh, I think that probably some of it, to me, I think has to do with meaning making. I think it has to do with if you feel the impact of your actions immediately and directly, and you can see the way that the world is shaped and changed by those actions, because the world is relatively small, then that, I think, translates back into your real life in a way of you start to understand that your actions do matter. Whether or not you see the impacts of them, they still matter. And I think that's something that you get much more immediately within immersive experiences that you maybe don't necessarily get as much in the real world.
Thinking specifically about Starcruiser, which in some ways is such an ambitious experiment, and ultimately, I always think failure is this really ambiguous thing. Clearly, it did not run as long as I think was anticipated when it was announced, but had a really profound impact on a lot of people. And one thing, two things I'm very interested in. I'll start with the first one. I can't think of an experience I've had where people were invested in individual actors from theater.
Yeah.
Right? From movies, yes. From theater, no. And that seems to have been something that happened here. Is there something about that kind of immersive interaction that's leading to that sense of, whether you call it a parasocial relationship or closeness or celebrity, what's happening?
I think that it's because the connections that you experience are real. And that within, especially something like Starcruiser, the experiences that people were having and the connections that they were making with those cast members were not imaginary. They were real. You're looking somebody in the eye, you're sharing profound emotional experiences with one another, and those things are real. So it makes a lot of sense to me that people are fans of that, especially when somebody is especially good at cultivating that sort of sense of being seen, that sort of sense of belonging, and you are part of this, and you are needed, and you are wanted here, and I see you, and I value you. I think that that's something that we don't do that as much in the real world. You walk down the street, and people don't really look you in the eye. They don't say hello. And when you're in an imaginary world, people do. The environment changes, and we change as a result of that.
Thank you. Yeah, the other thing I was interested in is there were developed on Starcruiser this really intense culture of trading. Which, as far as I understand, that was not designed in.
Totally
that was
emergent.
A thing that happened.
Absolutely.
And it's also then carried over into Batu and to other parts of the theme parks, right?
Yes.
Was there something about how that system was that was making people want to be generous or to share or to why did that pop up there and not in any of these other spaces?
It's so interesting because there's a little bit of a cultural zeitgeist. It's happening in a lot of different places. So within festivals, people are doing this. At a lot of concerts and shows, people are making bracelets and exchanging them with one another. So there's something about this post-COVID world and people coming back together and connecting with one another where they're giving gifts to each other and giving each other mementos. And so we saw it within Starcruiser, but I think we're also seeing it in a lot of other spaces within our world right now. And I don't know why it's happening, but I think it's really beautiful.
It's so sweet, right? All the Taylor Swift friendship bracelets and stuff. I'm I love this. And I think it's interesting too because it also feels childlike.
Yes.
Right? I remember being this as a kid where I was I'm going to take one for all of my friends, or I'm going to cut up all my stickers so everyone gets one. And it's a really different kind of posture towards the world, I think, than most of us live in.
Absolutely. And it's infused with meaning because when somebody gives you that token or that object, there's a story attached to that. And every time that you look at that object, it will remind you of that story and remind you of that connection. And I just think that's really beautiful.
I think this is my last question, and then we'll open it up for other people's questions. I wanted to ask about, so live action role playing like has play in the title, right? But you actually see play in almost all these spaces.
Yeah.
Like, what about play is tying these together, or how does play tie these together?
Yeah.
And what does it mean to play in the arts, or play in, right, your identity?
I think that play is how we learn. And I think that when you are playing with others, you cannot not be curious, right? You have to be open to experience in some way. So I think that when you cultivate an atmosphere of play, you're also creating an atmosphere of curiosity, learning, growing, and renewal in a lot of ways. And I think that that's something that as we get older, sort of societally we get told that that's not acceptable, that's not the way that we behave, but it is the way that we behave. It's very, very human and completely natural for us to play, for everything to play. I mean, even bees play, you know? We're learning more and more about our world always, and seeing that like all these things are deeply interconnected.
Great, thank you so much. So we'll open up for questions from the audience. I think if you have a question, you flag because there is a microphone.
Do you have a rant about Westworld? And if so, could you tell us it?
A rant about Westworld? Not really.
Criticisms, reactions.
There is a LARP right now that takes place in, I want to say Spain, in which they have a entire like movie set of like a Wild West town, and people come and they play as both guests and the androids and the people who work at the company. And they do this for like a week, and there's all kinds of like risk mitigation strategies and like things that they use in order to put this stuff on stage. And I think it's rad that people want to do that, and that if you're acting within the bounds of your own comfort and you have like systems and tools to be able to help you manage those things, that's awesome. That's great. I think it's cool in a way also that Westworld has introduced to a large number of people this concept of like an immersive like live action gaming experience. And hopefully people won't take the dystopian part of it too seriously and see that there are other parts of it that could be very fun and that don't have to be as dramatic and adult themed. But I do think it's cool that somebody could say, oh, what I do is, you know, like Westworld, and then people will get it instantly, because it's been very hard to explain to my family members what I do.
I mean, I think the real lesson of Westworld, right, is like be nice to the robots.
Right.
Like, if you're nice to the robots, it's fine.
Totally fine.
It seems to me that at this point, everything that you've been doing has been for adults. But children are very vulnerable to that sort of thing. And do you watch for that? Do you not let them have it? Or, you know, how you have to, they need protection.
So Star Wars Galactic Starcruiser was very family friendly. So there were adults and children all playing together. And that's something that was very much by design, right? Like kids want to play within these worlds. And there are certain activities that we would like age limit, like lightsaber training. You could only do that if you were 7 years old and up because a variety of different reasons, right? But when kids and adults play together, I think it's this transmission of learning happens both ways, right? There are things that kids teach us that are so important. And things that we can teach kids that by playing with them transmit much more easily. So, you know, kids need to be protected, but also adults need to be protected. We all need to be protected in various ways. And sometimes we can only learn these things by doing it together.
Hi, thank you. I'm really interested in how you highlighted meaningful agency as the intersection of all of these fields, and I'm also a game maker, and I think a lot about this term agency in relation to game mechanics and whether or not interaction and agency are interchangeable or not. But one thing I was thinking about is this idea of meaningful agency, and maybe asking you like what that means, like what constitutes meaningful agency, especially when maybe in our lived like regular lives we are experiencing agency that feels like an illusion, or we don't have access to meaningful agency. And so what are we coming to these game spaces for, if you could identify that a little more?
Yeah, so when I think about meaning making, I think about it's a form of story crafting and creating narratives that are rich and involved that help support our values, right? So we all have different values, and sometimes we have a good understanding of what those values are, and sometimes we don't. But when we engage in something that feels meaningful, usually it's because it's in support of one of those values. So we can get into like the deep like narrative psychology parts of this, but just I think that a lot of these things come back to those values, those ideas that we hold, and hold ourselves up against as we sort of like think about how we impact our world and who we want to be. And yeah, those values are just the underpinning of all that.
So I'm really curious about the intersection between immersive worlds and fandom. And as a designer, I'm just curious, how do you design an immersive world for something you may not be a part of the fandom of, and how that's different from the things you design that you are a part of the fandom?
Ooh, that's a great question. So, like with Starcruiser, I have been a Star Wars fan since I was 4 years old. So that was an easy thing for me to be excited about. That said, some of my fellow directors, you know, had not seen a single Star Wars film or anything until they started working on the project. So I think it's like probably healthy and necessary to have a lot of different perspectives when you're crafting an experience like that, because you know, some people really want to go into the really deep nerd lore stuff, and it's nice to have that available for them if that's what they want to do. And some people are like, I'm here because my kids dragged me here, and it's nice to have an experience that's available for them as well. So I think that I think we need both.
Hello, Caro. Thank you for your talk. So currently in immersive experiences, a whole host of new technologies are coming out, from AR and VR to extended reality to brain-machine interfaces to all these really cool haptic technologies. And with each succeeding technology, what you're seeing is a line between reality and the immersive world being blurred, right? Like Apple with the spatial computing.
Yeah.
I just wanted to hear your take on whether this blurring of the lines between the immersive and the real is something that is troubling, or something that is probably something we should be hopeful about.
I don't think there's an or. I think it's both, right? It's both and. Like,
can you please elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, I think that anything can be used as a great tool that can also be used as a weapon, right? So I think that we have to be mindful and judicious and like try to practice good ethical standards when we create experiences. And that said, there is no substance that cannot be turned into an addictive substance. So yeah, I think it's both. Yeah, and we're making the holodeck. Yeah, some of the benefits. So I think that one of the things I love the most about this type of work is that nothing proves faster that you are capable of more than you thought than when you put on a character, and that character proves to you by their actions that you had certain things within you the whole time. So I have seen people transform just by like putting on a mask and a hat, right? And that is absolutely amazing and can provide a lot of like therapy. It can provide a lot of like ground for self-development. It can change people's minds in extremely important ways. So, and provide us a lot of empathy. So I think that, again, like any great tool can also be used as a weapon, but that it is a great tool.
Yeah, I guess I have a question about people who participate in these events. The anticipation, I think, is an important element because you're anticipating an event in terms of what you think will happen or what motivates you to go to these things. Mm-hmm. So you probably have people that go once and never go again. It's like they've done it and they won't go. Then you have other people who are serial. They go a lot because they want to figure out the system or they want to figure out the narrative and find a way to game it. And then you have both of them interacting in the same event.
Yeah.
So how does that affect these events where you have people who just go once versus people who are addicted to it and are trying to modify or find out things that the
Absolutely.
other people don't?
I think that this is a question really that's about culture, right? And it's about the culture that you intentionally cultivate at your experiences. And that culture can be supported by the mechanics that you put into your system, or that culture can be appended by the mechanics that you put into your system. So if you create a culture of welcoming and create a culture where the players who are kind of sort of veteran players are encouraged and rewarded to bring new people in, make them feel welcome, make them feel supported, uplift them, show them how it's done, then you can cultivate an environment that everybody can play together very nicely. So I think that it requires being very thoughtful with your design and getting a lot of designers to look at it and poke holes in it, right? And be like, I don't think that this is working the way you thought it was going to work. Because some of these things can create a dynamic of competitiveness or measuring or other things, but it doesn't have to work that way.
Hi, to build on the gentleman's question, have you learned that there is a certain amount of critical mass that you need to really get people to buy into the experience?
Oh, that's a great question. No. So there are experiences that are designed specifically for just one participant, and there are experiences that scale up to thousands of participants. And I think that there is ground here for things to be even larger than that. So I don't know that there is a minimum number because people sometimes have just as incredible of an experience with no one else, just them doing these different experiences, or just like one other person in the room with them, as they do with these massive kind of like multi-day festivals. So I think it really just depends on what the individual's looking for.
Hi, I'm curious to know how you prototype, or like you talked about values and everything. How do you know when something is working? How do you know when something is not working?
Yeah.
And specifically when you're like world building in that stage.
Absolutely. Well, we play test. You play test, you play test, you play test. Any game designer worth their salt will tell you that. So no matter how experienced you are with design, like your designs will absolutely go awry as soon as they meet contact with the players, right? So you need to build in time and affordance for play testing so that you can kind of see how people are interacting with things. There will always be edge cases, but there's usually like an 80% kind of people who are going to follow the same sort of paths. And if you can figure out what those edge cases are and find ways to kind of cleverly reroute them back into the main thing, then you can help to keep people on the rails, so to speak.
A couple of minutes ago, and you were talking about setting up a comment, and you said, well, it's not like you walk down the street and look people in the eye and say hello. And I must admit, my first reaction to that was, she's obviously not living in the Midwest.
No, I'm living in Boston. Nobody looks at each other. It's wild. When I was living in Florida, people would just like talk to you in the grocery store, and I was shocked. I was
Well,
like,
and I think that's a pretty common experience in Chicago, even across various racial communities and things, that people talk, so much so that if someone doesn't say hello, you kind of go, what's wrong with them, you know? Like,
yeah.
But the reason I ask that is, so many of these experiences are talking about creating these boundaries within which something can happen.
Yeah.
And then even the different kinds of things, which was very helpful when you sort of charted out the ways in which these things are manifesting in various realms. But I'm wondering about maybe realms like community-based public art, or you know, interactions that might happen in an open space like a park. Like there's a dance floor in downtown Chicago that I'm not sure if it happens again since COVID, but where people would just go and, you know, and dance together. Like So I'm wondering about whether, in some ways, are these things like setting a boundary where people act within them, as opposed to maybe actually thinking about dissolving kinds of boundaries where things might happen in real life.
Again,
like
I think this is kind of a
unmediated by
both
this,
and.
huh?
This is sort of a both and situation, I think. But I think that what you're pointing at is really important. I think that this, like, we have an epidemic of loneliness right now in the United States, and that's happening because of something in our culture. And I think that we're seeing a lot of convergence of these art forms because people don't want to feel isolated, they don't want to feel lonely. And maybe we need to create these imaginary worlds in order to kind of give ourselves permission in order to be able to do that again. And you're right, I don't think that that should be relegated only to the realm of fantasy. It would be amazing if we could bring that back out into the real world in more robust ways. I think that we have the cure for loneliness, it's just not very well distributed.
We have time for one more question, so whoever is up, someone ask a question, please, or I will glare at you. Okay.
You mentioned a lot of related fields that all sort of point to the meaningful agency, immersive theater, game design. What do you, installations are, you know, anything in that realm. What do you think about the practitioners in each of those spaces, and are they still very siloed, or is there starting to be more communication between those fields?
Much more communication between those fields because of, I mean, things like this, because of there was a fantastic conference that was run at the University of Arizona recently called Worlds in Play, in which they were bringing together practitioners and artists from across these disciplines and showing each other's art. And that led to a number of collaborations. Like, I'm now collaborating with 2 people who I met at that festival. And so these things are starting to kind of happen in more and more in pockets. And like, I think also universities are starting to put a lot of funding and investment towards these things because they realize that there is a path here towards the future of these creative spaces. So I'm very hopeful that we're going to see a lot more collaboration across discipline, and not just for the, you know, giant media conglomerates that can afford to do it, but at the most basic, like, community level as well.
Well, thank you all for coming out. Thank you to Caro. Thank you, Chicago Humanities Festival, and I hope everyone has a fantastic night.